Wow. So a lot's happened since the last video, and although I'm trying to focus on more greenfield aspects, the examples from contemporary events are strong reinforcers about the things we're talking about. So, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's taken a few weeks to write this script, and it was written about 10 days before the 20th of January 2021 and completed the day after the 20th. So some aspects of this are going to date rather quickly as we go through it. So first off, seems Trump was advised not to pardon himself, as this may be an admission of wrongdoing. As such, it has been said he is now belligerent and refusing to grant pardons to anyone else. Turns out this wasn't true. He did that 70 pardon on the last hours of his last day. Suffice to say, before he did that, it reminded me of that Manson-style equity. You know, if I can't, then so can't anyone else. Merit is irrelevant. Context is irrelevant. And the whole evaluation of a situation, you know, who deserves pardons, is pegged to a reference to self. So I wonder what plans he has for Steve Bannon, because it's obviously self-serving. And we just about mentioned on the back end of the last video about the events in the United States regarding those riots, and by definition, a terrorist attack. We're still yet to see what transpires. A bit more's come out in the last few days, which again is going to date this video. But I do want to continue with looking at beliefs, which, as I said last time, would include that video, this video, maybe I'm thinking the next one too. A lot to cover. Oh, and yeah, I had a 2 terabyte hard drive fail during the production of the previous one, which didn't help. A lot of rendered files needed to be re-rendered. Old PC getting out of date, need a new one. Anyway, last time we left off looking at categories. We introduced the simple ones of the SVO model and the perceptual positions of self, counterparty, and others, and the unspecified fourth position of the whole system. I listed some distinctions of the hundreds or even thousands available, and how it's useful to develop more distinctions to enable us to add nuance. Otherwise, we degenerate to flat earth and anti-vax and science denier thinking. We degenerate to homophobia and transphobia and xenophobic bigotry that inevitably leads to a kind of authoritarian fascism, and, well, it seems we weren't that far away. Sad, really. Without distinction or nuance, it seems that one just becomes a more exaggerated example of oneself, but amplified along the general direction that one's already going. That is to say, racists become more racist, xenophobics become more xenophobic. When they realise that xenophobia doesn't work or isn't working, they double down on it and just become more of what they already know, because they're not building new distinctions. They're relying on the old ones, but doubling down on them. And I use the example of films like The Cannibal Holocaust as an example that it had been noticed by the director that sensationalism of events had overtaken the analysis of the underlying causal relationships in contemporary news. Even today, Fox News announced it's going to double down or double up the number of opinion pieces. I can only assume this is because they even haven't got the time, the inclination to spend resources actually establishing what the facts are and verifying them, or that their audience isn't interested in knowing that they're just appealing to those with very basic distinctions about how the world works. We also mentioned the shift from the doings and the experience of life to the fetish of objectification. I think also, and I'm going to get into it a bit later, this fetish of objectification is also to do with controlling things. It seems like, we can't necessarily control an experience, but we can certainly have control over a thing just intuitively. We can pick up an object, we can move it. It has no resistance to our power. It has no sentience, it can't move on its own. So we have a lot of control over objects. So I suppose there's a temptation in some kind of warped model of mind where if we can objectify somebody, we can turn them into an object that we can do to, rather than do with. Anyway, it's been 40 years or so since Cannibal Holocaust, and the demise of journalism is almost complete. As Nick Davies noted in his book, it's degenerated to reporting that he said, that she said, that he said, and it's basically repeating what someone said. It may be true that they said that thing, But modern journalism makes no effort, it seems, to establish whether what was said is true. There are journalists that do this, few and far between, but it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to do that. And, in the hysteria of the last few months, they say a week is a long time in politics, but it seems like 7 hours is a long time in politics. And it's just been a roller coaster ride. No time to catch your breath, let alone catch up on and establish the facts of what's happened. Again, focus and manufacture of sensationalism. Got to get the copium, got to get the endorphins going, got to get the cortisol in the veins. Irrelevant of who said what. Not whether what was said was in fact true, it's just whatever creates emotion. If it bleeds, it leads, all that. So for me, this relieves people who ought to be responsible of their accountability, and a professional journalist ought to have a responsibility and accountability. And they keep the governments accountable and responsible, at least in theory. Well, that's how it's supposed to work, but it just seems like we've got propaganda engines running. It's also well known, I guess, that courts in the UK last year at least have ruled that politicians can lie to the public without consequence. So it seems like it's a bit of free-for-all now. And the most recent events, certainly in the last week of recording, that social medias have closed down certain accounts that are deemed now to be a public menace. Small issue, but, well, maybe not. But some in the blogosphere are making a big deal out of it and lying as to the reasons. It's suspension of free speeches and censorship, progressive left radicals taking over, thought crime, hate, not allowed to say what you want anymore. I think they sense the existential threat that if a president's personal account can be shut down, then so can theirs. Not because of free speech are they worried, but because they will lose their ability to monetize eyeballs. The algorithms make it so that breaking stories have a short window of opportunity to compete for views. In this current maelstrom of news stories, mostly low impact, high sensationalism, getting to press first seems paramount for getting the sweet ad money from those eyeballs. Those who are acting irresponsibly recently have been shut down and, as a consequence, lost their revenue, but they don't want to seem to be honest about this because it exposes their grift. Instead, and again, they have to shift the argument to a proxy token. But my free speeches. And recent reporting by the BBC has been atrocious. I'd not been on the BBC for quite some time, but when the newscaster I was watching referred to the CEOs of social media companies as the kings of data, my heart sank a little bit. King? King? This is a reference that I expect to see on a clickbait YouTube title or the Daily Hate Mail. It may be worth pointing out, as I expect you already know, kings are not elected. However, billions of social media users gladly give over their data. And you also have the choice not to do so. And, by the way, what has that to do with free speech or closing down accounts for terms of service violations, which users agree to when they sign up? So I'm not repeating anything you haven't already heard or know. Don't like the terms? Don't enter the contract. That's about as free as you can get, isn't it? Deciding whether to enter a contract or not, whether to be bound by it or not. And you see, there is this clever reversal of language, and I'm sure you've seen it too. What these advocates for free speeches mean, it's not okay for others to censor them, but they want to be the ones censoring, but don't have the power to do so, and so moan about it with conflated and thinly disguised frustration about not being able to get their own flavour of propaganda out the door. And also, if you're an 80s child too, do you recall that made-for-TV series V? Yeah, about how a fascist uprising could happen here, and how it came with a friendly face and a smile and promises of rosy futures. Yeah, that just came to mind. Yeah, it seems that there's no limit on it. I mentioned in the Mills Methods video, in passing, reference to efficacy of vaccines, particular vaccines, and while the situation is still developing and things improve, some drug manufacturers seem to be pushing out of context and what borders on obfuscation and denigration of the competition by carefully constructed narratives that are misleading, very naughty, trying to say that the competitor's vaccine isn't as efficacious as their own, but in a very roundabout way. Obviously then large block purchasers might be persuaded to go for a different vaccine over another for particular reasons. This has significant impact on national health, in fact global impacts, and this is not a thing to be played with for profitability or financial gain. But here we are. Time will tell, and as I also mentioned, while an imagined thing for some, unfortunately, that time will be fatal. Right, anyway, back to beliefs and different ways of knowing the world through categories. This is fundamental and ought to be emphasised through the eyes of tradition. What worked, what's happening now, what is changing, and how this affects behaviour in relation to tradition, and then what we might expect from the future. There certainly seems to be a component linked to personal anxiety, with such an emphasis on modern life centred around commercial interests, dependent on money, or the accumulation of it, or at least access to it, or at least a recurring income to assure our future, and thus the pension and the retirement fund become important. And as we've said, risk is the evaluated threat to things we hold as important. So as we get older, our earning power decreases. That's obviously a threat to our income capacity. Therefore, we have to rely on savings even more. And then, if the pound is devalued or currency is devalued, that's also a threat to our retirement fund. But there's more. We ought like a level playing field. We could bear a bit of a hit on the pension due to market forces if it affects us all at the same time. So if money itself is devalued, it's devalued for all. This isn't what's happening. The COVID thing, the Brexit thing, have revealed just how inequitable and corrupt the system behind the facade has been. And as things have gotten more desperate, even those in power and those with wealth have stopped even pretending to hold any pretense of equity. They're just saying now, they're saying out loud that bit which, laissez-faire capitalists are not supposed to say out loud. And it's revealing the divide. As an example, I go back to what Elon Musk said about he can coup whoever they want. While that statement unfortunately is true, that's the bit you're not supposed to say out loud. And this is what I'm saying. Even the pretense of honesty, integrity and fair-mindedness has gone out the window. They don't even pretend it anymore. So at this time of writing, just after the thing in the US Capitol, there are suddenly lots of calls for unity and healing right now, mostly from the right. Almost as though they don't want to be held accountable, but immediately be forgiven for their insurrection attempts and incitement to riot, which seen 5 people killed. I suspect also due to the time sensitivity of the inauguration, not all the details are released, nor even known, at that time, at this moment. It's kind of still ongoing. But, I have to ask, imagine a contrived example of a drunk driver ploughing through a family who were walking down the sidewalk. The next day, the courts, the police, the drunk driver called for the lone survivor not to hold a grudge and to be accepting and welcoming and thinking of healing the situation. Even worse then if the driver wasn't in fact drunk but decided to drive on the sidewalk and his expression of freedom and not being controlled and not being compelled to drive on the road between the white lines. It's just nonsense. So why then do domestic terrorists expect more favourable outcomes and those who were complicit in inciting it? To me, this just demonstrates that lack of empathy and understanding so typical of someone who wants their ends justified by any means. They are saying the words to evoke forgiveness with the wrong tone at the wrong time without understanding, because they know it's what they need to say to get what they want rather than actual desire for meeting of the minds. I've mentioned this before. It's these lunatic people you come across in life occasionally who say stupid things like, that tree will grow back in no time. Let me cut it down so I can paint your windows because a few branches are in the way. Or, this stock will pick up in no time, so lend me your money or invest in this stock. Or, lend me so much money, you'll get it back in no time. Same sociopathic tendency. They'll say whatever they want. They'll say whatever they need to get what they want, not what's true. Like robots, without feeling or empathy. They're just saying the words. And a bit later I'm going to get onto the difference between syntax and semantics. It's quite interesting, now that I think about people who just say the words to get what they want, rather than convey meaning to establish a meeting of minds. So I wonder if you'll be strong enough to confirm a particular fantasy that I suspect you may have had. And I suspect this is a male thing. And I'd speculate it's a little bit to do with so-called toxic masculinity. By my reckoning, you too will have had the hero fantasy. Maybe when you were younger, boarding class or college, or maybe even in the late teens, you'd daydream where some emergency situation occurred and only you could save the day. So what are the popular ones? You're on that flight. The pilot collapses. He had fish for lunch. The co-pilot is equally incapacitated, and bad weather and an electrical storm has fried the autopilot. And the call comes out on the aircraft tannoy. Anyone with flight experience, please come to the flight cabin. No, not an announcement any passenger ever wants to hear, but, this is fantasy. And of course, you save the day with a bead of sweat, and land the plane, and back on the ground, news has spread and the press is waiting, and they ask you, surely you were scared, and coolly you wipe away the single bead of sweat from your forehead, and say no, and don't call me Shirley. Or maybe it was the terrorist attack fantasy at the train station where you just happen to be separated by coincidence from the masses in the crowd, but also unseen by the terrorists, and you can use your Jason Bourne skills to kick names and take ass. Oh, wait a minute, that's not right. Hang on, sorry, wrong fantasy. Anyway, I think this is a common adolescent fantasy. However, this is why they call them man-boys, is it? Man-childs. Listen to a few of the people who gave interviews at the riot in the US Capitol. Some were very angry. Some have very good reason to be angry. Some, it's clear, know that they are not heard. Some are desperate for reform, desperate for change, and many, know of the corruption. However, there seems to be a strong contingent that are LARPing to feel significant, stood there in their tactical gear. Some, of course, out-and-out fascists, and some out-and-out American Taliban. A combination. Many different forces, many different grievances, many different ideology, conflated coalescing on a single point, a culmination. The people have put up with fraud and corruption and fed up of not being listened to, and finally pushed back, ironically, at the most inappropriate time, over a fraudulent election that wasn't, at the strong suggestion of their cult leader, who was, after all, a fraud. Still, so many can't or refuse to see it. And we've seen it before. Jonestown, Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, Trumpism, a cult of personality, and it's very weird. Bonaparte was the past master, Hitler the same, and what's weird is how these dictators look to each other, and then seem to be joined in the illusion of believing the previous cult leaders were actually great dictators. Trump seems to admire the dictators. Why? For example, Hitler was a moron, idiotic, and no great strategist or thinker, lazy by many accounts and incompetent by others. The rise of the Third Reich was so big, so fast, and with an impact since unmatched. And because of this, I suspect, many misattribute the effect to the cause. Since it was such a huge event, the temptation is to think it must be due to one man's supreme strategy, planning, tactics, and evil genius. Nah, this is what makes it all the sadder. That a nation can be taken in by the cult of personality, propaganda, and lies. The parallels with Hitler's government and the Trump regime make similar reading. Rather than carrying out duties of state, they spent most of their time infighting and backstabbing each other in an attempt to either win his approval or avoid his attention altogether, depending on what mood he was in that day. Those statements made by Ernst Amstegel, one of Hitler's confidants. Similarly, Hitler's incompetence was retconned as being a deliberate ploy to get his own way, 4D, 5D chess kind of thing. We've heard that one again. Turns out Hitler too didn't do much in the mornings except read the papers and concern himself with the media and his celebrity. He was deeply insecure about his own lack of knowledge, preferring to either ignore information that contradicted his preconceptions or to lash out at the expertise of others. He hated being laughed at, but enjoyed it when other people were the butt of the joke. Seems he would perform mocking impressions of people he disliked. Where have we seen this recently? I'm going to make more comments about the anxiety of inadequacy and the desire to humiliate others is a fascistic tendency. Before Hitler, Bonaparte, the same. He had near control of all the press, and he had extensive propaganda engines. His military successes were reported, and his prowess was enhanced with stories of fake battles, and his losses and mistakes reframed or looked over altogether. What's ironic is the would-be dictator themselves falls for the propaganda of the previous dictator. Like I say, it's a weird thing, it's the Dunning-Kruger. They don't know that they're too stupid to realise that they're being stupid. They don't have the distinctions to be able to tell that what they think is great is actually the propaganda of the previous dictator. So, you get this upstart, perhaps a little narcissistic, sticks out a bit. A small cult-like following starts by association. This starts the ball rolling. And it seems to encourage the would-be dictator who has already, by a young age, read a very selective account or prose of how Hitler came to power, or how Bonaparte conquered this, or how Julius Caesar ruled that. And they start to uptake only on these apparent upsides, which are written with a favourable slant, whereby the failings and accuracies of the events are actually sidestepped for sensation, for adoration and worship of the power. And its grotesqueness is left out because that would spoil the illusion. Again, I've mentioned previously to travel in mind, travel in body, travel in spirit, travel in geography, whatever. But it seems like if you live in a country that at some time or other won a great war, where I live, UK, Britain, full of it, then when you go to the library to pick up any book that was written shortly after the time of that victory, well, it's not going to say we lost, is it? Or that we did bad things. It's yes, we were victorious, and Great Britain, blah, blah, blah. Maybe the author wants to ingratiate themselves with the winners of the last war. Of course, the national sentiment is only going to see it from our point of view. So this is why I say travel. Go to the library in the country that had the shit kicked out of them and read their account of that same event. Very different. So for me, the Hitlers, Bonapartes and Mussolinis and Trumps are actually enacting their Christ Saviour fantasy. In Trump's cases, the delusion is clear, as we live in this time and know that it was AstraZeneca and Pfizer and others that had resources to make those vaccines. It was the nurses and doctors on the front line that have been saving lives and continue to do so. See, front line. We romanticise the language of war and the saviours. No, I don't think it's to be romanticised, but certainly appreciated in the hard work and dedication it takes to be a healthcare professional. And then to realise they get paid shit for their efforts. The dichotomy arises, ought we pay them their worth, which costs a lot of money, or stir up national sentiment to make them heroes? And in this, as they identify with this hero as ascribed, well, it's kind of awkward for a hero to ask for a pay rise, isn't it? Since then, in the minds of the watching public, any healthcare professional asking for a pay rise who's now been painted as a hero now just becomes a mercenary. They're only doing it for the money, see? So it makes it very awkward for them to actually ask for what they're worth by doing this kind of hero worship. Romanticising the trope of the saviour actually enables abuses, and worse, the virtue, again with the aesthetic, creates a populist snowball effect where, next thing we're clapping for the NHS. I'm sure they appreciate the thanks, but I'm sure they'd appreciate a decent pay rise too, and a bit of a scale back from 80-hour working weeks in many cases. So this is my point. It's the hard graft of these workers, the dedication of medical professionals, the scientists who spend years just getting the tickets to even be able to clean the floor in some of these labs, let alone work on cutting-edge drugs, has nothing to do with the politicians or the Trumps. Nothing. But Trump comes, I did, fuck off. It's this delusion again that just because you happen to be sat in the CEO's chair when stock prices go up or some event happens in the market doesn't mean you caused it. You just happen to be sat in the chair, but they so easily take credit for it. So instead of winning with arguments and a utilitarian or consequentialist approach to deploy state assets in a useful way, which requires listening, understanding, nuance and careful consideration, it's much easier to rule by propaganda and pay with platitudes that play into people's heroes' fantasy, the saviour. And as I say, it's quite a manipulative thing to paint somebody as a hero because if they then identify with being a hero, well, heroes don't ask for pay rises. So I've paid, I've avoided having to give them their pay rise, and just by use of a bit of cheap propaganda and standing out on the street corner and clapping them like, NHS workers were heroes. It's cheap. And in the end, it deprives them of their claim to be paid properly. Which is why these dictator types are media obsessed. All you have to do is control the appearance of what's happening, steer the perception, and then you don't actually have to do anything. Such a leader's incompetence is never tested. Instead, it's masked by propaganda and masked by bigger and bigger lies, masked with frivolous lawsuits that just push things down the road. They project things and make insane accusations. And this is easy when the cult following will even write and produce that propaganda out of their own desire to ingratiate themselves with their cult leader. Then the cult leader leans into their favourite propaganda engine. And when that doesn't lean back, when that news network doesn't respond, the cult leader switches to a new propaganda engine. Again, the hallmark of fascistic power, align with anyone who gives them more power. There is no ideology. This is why it's irrational, it's incoherent. There is no plan. It's just whatever gets more power for power's sake. They don't even do anything with the power except accumulate more power. And that's why it's very hard to argue with Nazis, because there is no argument there. Have you seen, for example, the defence that some film directors get when they make qualitatively bad films? The Star Wars franchise, beloved, and one or two of the recent trilogy have been a bit suspect. But the fans, the hardline fans, will retcon and explain away the false plot holes and abysmal dialogue. They'll create a fantasy backstory that explains away these plot holes. This happens with even more fanaticism and devotion with cult leaders, and it seems, case in point, Trumpism. They really want their king, and I suspect this is what QAnon is all about. And there was a recent post today, I think on Reddit, by the Q account. I don't know whether it's a laugh or a joke, I've not looked into it, I've only seen a screenshot, where the Q account has basically denounced all previous posts as satire, and that they've deleted them, and there's a notice there to law enforcement agencies that it was all satire. Well, where have we heard this before? These people who get on big platforms shout racist and homophobic rhetoric, and then when they get called out for it, it's just a joke, bro, it's just a joke, but too late, damage done. It's also interesting to note that after the Twitter ban, suspension of Trump's account, Fox News, for the first time in 20 years, has had a week of viewership ratings in second or third place. It seems that the dictator and their chosen propaganda network fuel each other. Even Twitter has calmed down since the ban. Yet more evidence that deplatforming works. Some are quoting a 73% reduction in online, hate crime, bullshit, misinformation. I don't know how they measure that metric. Yet the propagandists are still busy sea-lining about free speech. Any content that they can twist to put out that gets views, it doesn't matter what happens. It's just outrage and marketing and complaining about this and alleged hypocrisy that. The argument falls flat on the grounds of free speech. It's a red herring. What they really mean is that they've not been able to monetize their hateful rhetoric because Twitter, Facebook, YouTube have been culling effectively Nazi accounts. So when these people say they've been losing 2,000 followers per hour, what they're really saying is we've been losing the fascistic followers. Not sure one should be advertising that. The cult followers are unified in the idea that one man, their saviour, their God Emperor, can save them, and have chosen the most corrupt and inept of them all, and in this have latched onto a saviour figure. I don't know if this was a desperate reach for hope or a frenzied attempt to bring immediate changes via this authoritarian imposition, which is exactly what leads to dictatorships. Somewhat obliquely, I referenced this notion in a video quite a while ago now, where we talked about vampires. I do like the vampire films. While fictional, and not that films should be used as a basis for critical analysis, the metaphor is useful. So again, first the vampire moves in and takes out the low-hanging fruit whilst the vampire is weak, and just get into grounds with a new area. And so the homeless are taken out, the disenfranchised, the weak, the different, the isolated and the vulnerable. The foreigners who are more isolated, the dregs of society. Some sections of society mistake this for cleaning up the streets. They think the vampire is on their side as the consequences of the action seem aligned, yet the intent of the vampire is purely bloodlust, to become stronger. It has no specific target. It will align with anyone and anything that gives it power, much like the fascist. Then, when the weak and vulnerable are depleted, the vampire works its way up the list, but with increased strength. And, as the famous poem goes, then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Cults. Fascinating. We'll get to it later. Suffice to mention that it's not just political cults of personality. Think of the King of Pop. Who coined that phrase? And, looking back, the press at the time did give him a hard time. And didn't he moan about it? A lot. And now I'm wondering if the press were justified in the intrusion, yet defenders of the dead pedophile are still prevalent. King of Pop. King. There's that emperor, divine ruler fantasy again. Same mindset with the God Emperor of the United States. It's a common trope. People want to be the hero. Through this they can gain significance, worth and prestige, all in one go. I even heard interviews with the citizens dressed up in soldiers' outfits on the streets of places in the United States. When asked why he was there, this person said he was there to protect women and children from trouble. But he doesn't seem to realise he is the trouble. The fantasy is one thing, but playing it out in real life is cringe, LARPing. I don't know how much the media has influenced perceptions here. Take your hero of choice. There's plenty to choose from. John Matrix, John McClane, John Rambo, John Anderton, John Carter, John fucking Wick, John Connor, John Shaft, John Spartan, John Reese, John Kruger, John Nash, John Milton, and I'll stretch to Jonathan Hart. And mixing the myth of redemptive violence and the conclusion is inevitable. Just call yourself John and revel in the fantasy. It's only super cringe when it's played out IRL. Oh boy, speaking of cringe, I don't want to give it props, so I shouldn't mention it by name, but I'm going to have to because it's obscure. But the film put out by the propagandist hacks, the Daily Wire, called Run, Hide, Fight, plays right into this unlikely hero fantasy. I mean, the fantasy is compelling. It's the key turning point in the hero's journey. And we covered this when we looked at the film structure in the Bob Iger series. The reluctant hero. I didn't want to shoot or kill people, but I had to. Oh, the torment I'm going to suffer now. This burden I must carry for saving all those people. Think of the children. So you can watch the trailer on YouTube if you must. But this is exactly that fantasy I just described of the terrorist situation that our unwilling hero has accidentally walked in on. And in this specific case, it's a teenage girl, an armed teenage girl, who takes on several armed assailants in a hostage situation. And if you do watch the trailer, Run, Hide, Fight, just listen for the phrase guardian angel. There, the saviour trope invoked is a childish fantasy. This myth of the lone man with a gun. What's disturbing is that it normalises gun use. Just like our armed LARPers on the street corner, it normalises violence. Here we are in a minute, that school kids should all be packing heat while integrating their differential equations. And it's not just about normalising violence, but worshipping the violence as a virtue in a kind of sick fantasy, where a single person of power and overwhelming force is justified in not merely bringing a situation to resolution, but they do it with added humiliation on top. The makers of Run, Hide, Fight, the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's team, don't seem to realise that they're really belittling women, because if you think about it from their mindset, what they're trying to do is have this team of assailants who go into a school and create a hostage situation, but are undone, outmatched, outgunned, outplayed and outstrategized by a woman, which is written that way, I suspect, to humiliate the terrorists. Yes, being outdone by a woman is humiliating. That's the message that's unconsciously present in this film. They just can't not do it. I'd be more impressed with a psychological thriller where the intensity and conflict is resolved peacefully with engagement, meaningful dialogue, where in the end everyone gets what they need. Perhaps after serving a custodial and rehabilitative sentence. I wonder too if it matters to a young child in these situations in real life, who will forever suffer, I presume, PTSD, whether it matters whether someone's head was blown off by the hostage taker or that it was the hostage taker's head that was blown off in front of them. I'm not sure that they'll be able to resolve a difference. And so it's not just about, the humiliation by female. What's insidious, again, is the myth that's being perpetrated. It's pro-gun propaganda now. Typically, I think people from the UK, like myself, generally object to guns, and I do too. It just ups the ante in any situation. From another point of view, that's the point. But like I've said before, the US and UK are very different. The culture in the US has derived from the foundations of how the Constitution is formed and the Second Amendment, make the cultural context very different, and I'm actually somewhat ambivalent over the matter. But I do have concerns where guns are turned into jewellery accessories, or that gun sales are increased by the proposition that school kids should be armed, or that the fear of school shootings is used as a marketing device. If you want to buy a gun, get trained, do all the responsible things, but don't buy a gun and lurk around a schoolyard on the off chance that a school shooter will turn up that day. That's more likely to get you shot and innocent people shot in the panic. It seems dangerous to increase irresponsible gun ownership by appealing to this saviour myth and the myth of redemptive violence. It's why we employ professionals to do this job for us. It's why we have the professional arms. Yeah, but this is it. It's all myth, the creation myths, redemptive violence myths. And did we do myths of creation? That might be in the Science and Philosophy series that I did 1 to 9 part C of, that I've got to do 10 to 20 to pick up that. I can't remember whether we've already covered that off. But it's pertinent in the sense that the creation myths, where we came from, kind of give us a vector about our life. But I'll come back to that. But whilst I think about it, and schools and US schools and what we teach our kids, and the sense of national identity, and for UK school children, Shakespeare seems to be still featuring in the curriculum. I've mentioned this in passing before, that Shakespeare, and I'll insist on pronouncing it like that, Shakespeare. It doesn't work in received pronunciation. His play on words, see what I did there, work where the thick accent of the time enables the puns, that is the joke. To be honest though, I'm not up on Shakespeare, not at all, and I have very vague recollections from school. Nevertheless, prolific works, 38 plays, and covered many, many aspects of life. The struggle for power, love, property, love and delusions, love and treachery, the tragedies, the world as a stage, and all dramatised. I suppose it's an exploration of all those things, the relationships, the distinctions, and the emotional payloads that come with it. It's quite a body of work, so, who couldn't forgive him the occasional dick joke? I suppose the example I'm making, the point is that everyone has their opinion about Shakespeare, just like here I'm extolling my own opinions. I don't even remember reading the book at school, but here we are, it's just a dick joke, man. Yeah, and this is how we build these straw men. It's like the opinion or the meme of the subject matter takes over, and that itself supplants the significance of the original. So, again, what we have left is worship of a straw man of history. I suppose we should be attuned to national exceptionalism. It's always going to be there, sadly. Anyway, as I think back at school, I was just bored with it. I just accepted, yeah, he's this great literary genius none of us will ever live to, blah, blah, blah. So much for inspirational. Perhaps if the teachers had framed it as, hey, how to tell dick jokes, get paid a lot and be hailed as a cult leader, I might have listened. But now they just bored it down. Tradition. So just so you know, it had the opposite effect. For me, it made English a little boring as fuck. Pity. Because later in life I found out that linguistics is actually quite interesting, but somehow school made it boring and confusing. I even remember asking once, the English teacher asked the class, what's the tallest mountain on Earth? Now, I knew at the time, let's say Everest is 25,000 feet. I knew at the time there was a mountain that was 27,000 feet, but 3,000 feet of that was underwater. So its peak wasn't as high. as Everest's peak, but it was taller. So I asked, do you mean any mountain, including those ones that start underwater? Well, we're not talking about underwater mountains, are we? Well, I don't know. The question was ambiguous, and I'm asking for clarification, and I'm getting bollocked. I don't understand what lesson you're trying to teach me in this English class. And I remember in another English lesson, the instruction was to write a story, put the title on the first line, skip 2 lines, and then start writing. Okay, title on the first line, skip 1 line, skip 2 lines, start writing on the third line. And as I started writing, the English teacher was looking over me, and he looked down at what I'd done, and then he realised his mistake, and he said, no, what I meant to say is skip 2 spaces, only 1 line. But you said skip 2 lines. I know, but... Anyway, that was a long time in the past. I'm sure you all have your stories as well. So last time, where were we? Evaluation and discounting of past, present and future, and with cross-contextual categories of I, we, they, us, and we expressed that across many other value categories, and the one that we looked at were subject, verb, and object. Of course, you can conjure up many different matrices, different cross-contextual categories. And I think it's these categories of experience that give rise to agreement and disagreement, and this produces the content, the different ways of knowing the world, and this is the crux of it. And in regard to what to do, well, we certainly need to pay respect to the past. And that's why I brought up the kind of Shakespeare and the history. But we also need to empathise with the present, what's important right now, what's affecting people's lives, and speculate to the future. Which direction should we go? And it seems to me we need all three. So these are very, very different distinctions, past, future, present. I don't think it comes naturally, and this is the point. It requires active effort, good communication with the past, the present, and the future. Again, I've made my criticisms about the damage done to institutional knowledge bases over the last 5-6 years, the withdrawal from the EU and the single market. We're going to get left behind. We're not going to have those ties that maintain the interests of many people in Europe with people in the UK. The science institutions and diplomatic relations that have been damaged by the Trump administration, generational knowledge lost, and it's going to take more than a generation to get that back. So again, it's community meetings, elders to give us their experience, present examples to test what's currently working, and the new generation to see what's up and coming. Different times, different places, different categories, different maps. And there are so many more to discover. Why hold on to the ones that say long disproven things like dragons, be here? There are no dragons, except the ones we make. Previous language and maps told us what we needed for survival. In this modern age, surely we can do better than just survival. So I think I've already mentioned it, but just to interject a quick example, back in the 60s, Star Trek, the communicator, a future-looking device, no doubt based on what was cutting-edge science that was being speculated at the time as to what might be possible. And 30 years later, in the early 90s, devices were put on the marketplace through which we could communicate with anyone else on the planet who had one. Another example, 1942 was the launch of the first V2 rocket as inspired by von Braun and Dornberger with technical input by Thiel. And 27 years later, that technology got man to the moon. Ironically, and as I understand, von Braun always wanted to go to the moon. That's why he was inspired to study and learn and develop rocket technology. Of course, power at the time, Nazis had other ideas. And then Peenemünde and crossbow and paperclip and lots of nasty and horrid things in between, including the horrors of bombing the capital of my home country by use of those rockets. Yeah, war always starts out with infinite optimism of a quick win, but never turns out that way. We'll get back to that. I think also this global communication, it's been a massive change. We now have influx of data that human mind is just not adapted for. Suddenly we're exposed to the thoughts and ideas of billions of people, potentially. Obviously you can't suck it all in, but we have such a, we can get news reported from anywhere in the globe from cultures that we don't even previously had experience of. So it's difficult to make cultural sense of this without having lived it. And I think, again, this is a mistake a lot of people from the UK make, trying to impose their opinion about gun laws. I think in a very simplistic way, guns in the United Kingdom are not appropriate because the way that it's structured and the parliamentary supremacy is very different from how the United States has been constituted out of the rights of the people is the supremacy, not what Parliament says. But because we have similar ideas about capitalism and consumerism and we speak a common language, we assume the culture's the same. I don't think it is. So if there's confusion even about countries that are similar in terms of their individualistic outlook and consumer outlook and language, imagine the misconceptions and misunderstandings that happen when we try and map cross-culturally to regions that don't even speak the same language or have very different political ideology or very different ideas about collectivism. It's all well and good to say, oh, social credit, what a horrible idea, but people there seem to like it. So I think we only ever get a snapshot of other people's cultures or of the news that affects other people in these faraway cultures. Unless we've actually lived or are of that culture, it's never going to make full sense to an impartial observer. It's like, you have to evaluate it in terms of the culture as immersed. Then when you see all these disparate stories coming in from all these different cultures and we evaluate them according to our culture, it doesn't make sense. I think there's then a kind of indifference descends as we realise our culture steers our thinking and other cultures steer thinking there, and then we realise that actually there's no one right or best one, it's all relative. And in some sense a kind of realisation that it's all arbitrary, it just literally depends where you were born. And this is what I'm trying to use as an example, the gun rights in the US compared with the UK. In the UK we see it, it just doesn't make sense to us, but because we haven't lived to understand what it means in the United States, we don't understand why people would want a gun culture, and so we label it gun nuts or gun culture. It's just typically we haven't lived it. Now I'll mention this kind of scenario again, but instead of talking about things at group level, societies and culture, and then mapping that or trying to make sense of it or trying to make meaning of it in relation to our culture, the phenomenon also happens when we talk about I, the individualistic approach. Again, I'm trying to create the idea of perceptual positions change meaning, that we might not understand other people and their values and their systems and their ideology because we're always trying to map it back to our own. I wouldn't do that. You did. That makes you crazy, not me. That's that kind of thinking. And another point is that, we don't live globally. We live here mostly, locally. It's local things that actually have a higher day-to-day impact. But of course, the rise of fascism, when people see it being enabled and see it spreading, I know I've seen it in the United States and I'm starting to see it rise in Eastern Europe. It's slowly making its way here, and that concerns me. So there are a few who globetrot endlessly, very big travellers, and I wonder how they view it. Perhaps it ought not to be evaluated, but experienced in the context of each culture. So that is to say, it's not fair to evaluate it except in reference to itself. I've made comment on this before and elsewhere regarding political correctness and in context of making judgments. It's a confusion between, the political correctness, the bastardized version that says, oh, you can't say that about culture. It's not that you can't say it. It's that it can't even be evaluated properly. How do you evaluate subjectively one culture with another? I think maybe the best we can do is say, yeah, it's different. But we run into trouble when we take a solipsistic view and say, yes, ours is better. How do you know? You've not lived the other. I don't know, maybe in a sense it either makes things very confusing or totally arbitrary. And in this I can see why there is a temptation to go back to so-called simpler times, black and white thinking. It's captivating, it's easy, it's lazy, and somewhat shirking of responsibility, but also a bit cowardly. Certainly it's an alluring illusion. Back then, it wasn't simpler times, it's just that we lived more isolated, less aware of things going on, more in our own bubble, just didn't know about outside issues. Back then, we didn't have the tech that is taken for granted today, and in a sense, invisible. Back then, people were dying of all sorts of diseases that are now so easily prevented. Back then, children were on iron lungs, and polio was a thing. Back then, in 1950, there was only 2.5 billion people on the planet. What do we now? I think we're racing to 8, aren't we? That's 3.5 times the drain on resources. Just simply can't afford to be that inefficient about things anymore. So this sentiment, the desire to move back to those times, to be more traditional, I think it might be a euphemism, It's not a desire to move back to those times, so much as a desire to absolve oneself of the sudden responsibility of acting with a global conscience. No longer can we send our end-of-life ships to be run aground and broken up in some faraway land where the toxic sludge is just left to seep into the oceans or to be burned on site in those faraway lands, or worse, the vapours from abandoned fuel tanks explodes at the spark of an arc welder used to cut up the ship. Now we know, and we can see on the YouTubes and the blogs made by those locals the damage and harm and misery this is causing. How inconvenient for us. So what's the easiest solution here? Spend billions in decommissioning those ships in a sensible and responsible way, making safe that toxic waste, or lobbying the governments of those countries with cheap bribes, maybe favourable business contracts to prohibit the peoples of that country from uploading such stories and to make it punishable by imprisonment. So, do we take care of the problem for real, or control the narrative? Do we actually pay to do the right thing, or do we use a cheap solution of propaganda just to cover it over? Which distinction are we willing to use? Usually comes down to money. I wonder about people who, again, have to use clouded language to disguise what they want. It must be quite something to live in a world where you have to constantly lie to get what you want, because if you say honestly what you want, that is either arrested or in a funny farm. It's one thing to think it, another thing to say, yes, I want to return to colonial privilege with the full benefits and no responsibility and to be able to own slaves. Yeah, I'm sure that is a nice life, but hardly tenable, nor ethical, nor moral, nor fair. So instead of stating it outright, I want to be a colonial slave owner, they say a softer and somewhat clouded expression along the lines of returning to a more simpler and traditional times. And I assume they also mean women in the kitchen, women to do the cleaning, look after their kids, and all to do it with no pay. Yeah, you see, simpler times. From a solipsistic and self-centred point of view, simpler for me, but only because everyone else is picking up the burden. So using this coded language, the rhetoric of simpler times, is much more palatable and picks up traction, but it means the same thing as the other thing that I'm not supposed to say out loud, but the outcome is the same anyway. And that reminds me too of a very self-centred position, a lack of self-awareness and a lack of empathy due to being in those bubbles and not travelling in all the ways that can mean. And then there are those who are bigoted, racist and fascistic who do know full well what they do and employ this kind of sophisticated propaganda. It's one thing to say, return to traditional times, and then to allow people to draw any inference or conclusion that may or may not be correct, and then to say, yes, we too want simpler times, and all of a sudden, we get a Brexit vote because, well, that's simple, either in or out. Well, I want to be out to live my own sovereign life, whatever that means. It's a fantasy. And then there are those, typically young people who don't really know what they believe. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. It's just they're young and haven't experienced the world. They haven't thought this through yet. It's just, they haven't had time or incident to do it, political and otherwise. They simply have not built the distinctions yet. So they're kind of a little bit vulnerable, a bit naive. And it's not a criticism. It's just that's what you are when you're 12 years old. Several factors seem to be at play. Firstly, that saying, I don't know, seems to be now stigmatised. So there is a group of people that seem incoherent so far as they will try to agree with any questioner, and they will try to tell the questioner what they think the inquirer wants to hear, or they will agree with the social group for fear of ostracisation. As someone who's lived mostly alone, I can tell you you're not actually missing out on much by living alone. There's not a lot you're going to learn from a peer group who are aged between 12 and 30 years old. They just haven't lived, not yet. Read a biography instead. Read two, and grab a plane ticket and travel. When COVID's under control, of course. Brings me back to that case. Do you remember the one I made the reference to where the young woman was denied her preferred place at university? It turns out her social media video, where she said the N-word, was made out of ignorance. I actually heard from someone who claims to know her that she actually does support BLM earnestly, but at the time that she made the video, in her location, in her cultural context, people used the N-word. She just said it because she thought it was a bit edgy and everyone else was saying it, a bit of a joke because other people around her say it. And this is the point I've made before, that the casual participation to appease group memberships does so much harm when the cost of just not being a dickhead is almost zero, but the damage it does is massive. It makes it all the sadder to me that racism is perpetuated through this kind of institution, ignorance. Naturally, and as I've emphasised, there are nasty people out there who know full well what they do and leverage the ignorance, sometimes as a proxy machine, much like Trump did by inciting his minions to attack the Capitol. He won't suffer the consequences of that, but the army he stirred up, some of them will not know why they will be sent down for a 20-year stretch. They will be in jail not knowing that or not realising or not being able to face the fact that what they did was actually wrong. Likewise, teenagers using racist slurs under the misguided ignorance don't understand the damage they do, but are egged on by those that do. It's awful. There's the same issue with so-called dark comedy, which is being infiltrated by racist, ignorant bigots. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for a bit of dark humour in those moments when life is shit and the gallows loom. What else can you do but laugh? It's kind of preferable to look at that as absurd rather than pitiful. And as I've harped on about, that life itself is an absurd proposition, fired from the womb at speed towards a barn door that's peppered with leftover shrapnel of previous generations. It's comical and painful. But what isn't funny is mocking people for things outside of their control. Again, I've noticed here a very different distinction between US humour and UK humour. Brits tend to be more sarcastic, ironic, and quite specific in the target of their dark humour, quite cutting. But it will be harshly directed at an action someone did, or something stupid said. The US seem much more directed at the person themselves, hardly separable from insults and mockery of the person. I've watched, a couple of so-called roastings as shown on TV, and they're very different experiences, UK-US. I get the notion that the US has a more humiliating aspect to it, but the UK is more about rounding off the rough edges. The humiliation has also played into the fascistic rhetoric. The pain is the point, the suffering of others is the point. And one tool that is used is, as I say, humiliation. I need not bring to mind a denigration of people who are of different genders, different sexes, and different races. Like I said, sometimes it starts off small, like that guy in school who said some stupid shit, and his friends laughed at what he said. It's not that it was funny, they were laughing at his audacity and willingness to exceed common decency. It's that awkward laugh, rather than telling the old bestie he's a dickhead. We put up with it rather than find new friends. It's the path of least resistance under the cloud of being ostracised from the group again for bringing those into check. And the group also, the outlier also has the defence of, what are you, some liberal lefty? Seems some would rather keep friends of dubious character than have no friends at all. Then, out of this group, one of the friends tells him, hey, you should do stand-up comedy because you're so funny. And so it's taken to mind, and he does. And so the would-be comedian attracts a certain audience. The would-be comedian thinks he is actually funny because all these people laugh, but he's totally unaware of why people are laughing. It's a bit like the Neil Breen film getting a rating of 8.5 on IMDb. He doesn't realise it's people taking the piss. Yet, the feedback from the audience is the fuel that these characters need to become a more extreme version. The would-be comedian in this example doesn't know what a joke is, but he just says the most offensive thing he can think of, mistaking it for comedy. So they get the shock value, and they get that kind of reaction from the audience. And after a while, people stop laughing, and they don't know how to write a joke, so they just become more extreme. And then when the audience eventually turns on them, the cancel culture card is pulled, cancelling me, free speeches. Of course, there are those who are ignorant and full-on racists and fascists who like to get away with saying offensive things under the cover of free speeches. It's just a joke, bro. It's just a joke. Schrodinger's comedy, as it's known. So, going back to this difference between the distinctions I've noticed between the US and the UK in terms of roastings. In the US, it seems an excuse to verbally insult the victim as opposed to the UK version, which is a friendly bit of banter, though harsh, about the stupid shit they've done in the past. Or it can also be a bit humiliating, but the subtle difference is there's a distinction between the things they've done, the things they've said, and instead directing it at the person. However, some people are young and dumb and full of cum. Some grow out of it, but not before doing the damage and rallying and following and inspiring the next generation of outrage and offensive and destructive ideals. Like I said before, the next would-be dictator falls for the rhetoric and propaganda of the previous dictator, thinking it was real. And of course, there's a new crop every year, and the tradition persists. And this is the kind of ever-present and implicit institutionalized problems of racism, sexism, and general discrimination. We think it's normal because the people who were our previous generations did it, and we're just doing what they did. What's wrong with that? But let's be frank, Neil Breen's films are shit. Qualitatively, they're of poor quality. Incomprehensible stories, poor direction, awful dialogue, bad editing, nonsensical structure, yet, as I said, some of his films get 8.5 on IMDb. It's the fans having a joke. And I don't mean actual fans, I mean ironic fans that linger and loiter, who find joy in watching people make mistakes. They organise laugh parties, if you like. It's not that Breen's films are bad films that are so bad they're good. Breen films are just bad. The people who watch them, they laugh at the childish scripts. They laugh at the self-centred and egoistic attitude of Breen himself, who writes, directs, and stars, and edits and funds his own films. But he doesn't seem to know. Any attention seems to be taken as a demand for more. Much like the so-called comedians we find on YouTube who spout racist claptrap and think it's funny because they have over 200,000 subscribers, when in fact it's just fascist and Nazi followers who find excitement or joy in the humiliation and suffering imagined and caused by what the would-be comedian says. It's this triggering the libs thing. It's not that they've won an argument. It's not that they've bested the liberal with having better arguments. It's just that they've caused them to suffer. Oh, look at the anguish of the triggered lib, and that's what it's all about. The pain and suffering, that's all they focus on. So, the follower of the racist would-be comedian take pleasure in watching the suffering of others caused harm or imagined harmed by what the would-be comedian says. It creates this fantasy. And in the minds where the comedian says, let's go and gas this section of peoples, and they're saying it to be outrageous, and you can see the smile coming over the audience's faces as they almost are mentally masturbating to the image that's in their minds of them gassing. I don't even need to say which class of peoples, do I? Again, it's getting off on the pain, it's getting off on the suffering of others. So Breen keeps remaking the same film. I think he's made 5 now, and they're pretty much the same film, where he plays out this kind of techno-Christ saviour fantasy. And you get the very awkward feeling he uses the films as an excuse to get close and to manhandle the scantily clad young actresses in his films. In the narrative of the film, he's intimate or gets close to them to save them. He uses phrases like, trust me, follow me, I can save you, you just have to trust me. Basically what he's pleading is, do what I want you to do and say what I want you to say, just become my object. Trust me, it'll be good, it'll be okay. In being totally subservient to me, you shall find redemption. It's the Christ thing. It's creepy as fuck, is what it is. But we see this played out in real life too, with those LARPers on the street corner in the United States, found there, all dolled up in military kit, complete with an AR-15 penis extension, and they are there to save the women's and the children's from other LARPers, I presume, or other terrorisms, I don't know. So Breen gets the notoriety, people have the morbid curiosity, it's the rubbernecking again. We talked about that 20 odd episodes back. But Breen is now world famous, like Tommy Wiseau. And I don't know what happens next. I think he's already looking for investors for his next film. I think it may already be in, kind of pre-production. And it's probably going to be the same film. On the flip side, though, kudos to the guy. The dude's out there making his art within the limits of his budget and competence and living out his fantasy. Why not? Lots of people laugh at him, not with him. And I presume he ought to be free to do this. Why not? But, as I record this, it seems that if we are to have free speech absolutism, we need an educated listener with a well-developed sense of distinctions to realise the difference between actual comedy and racist propaganda told through the pretext of it being comedy. Slightly oblique to Breen films, which are centred on this cyborg Christ Saviour trope, is the so-called black pill. The red pill, the blue pill from the Matrix. We've got different coloured pills. I think I might have covered that in the last episode. Anyway, black pill. And, I mentioned this as it's a form of distinguishment, different from the red pill, the blue pill. It's black pilled. I'll put the list on the screen. So the black pill generally refers to a set of commonly held beliefs in the incel community which describe biological determinism, a kind of fatalism, nihilism, and it kind of leads to a defeatist attitude in respect of how they view themselves as being, eternally unattractive. And there's nothing that can be done about that. It's their lot in life. And so rather than, they've accepted the fact that they can't be changed. They are as they are. They're ugly. They're in this position, whatever. Therefore, the rest of the world changing is the solution to this problem. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say Breen is ugly, but in his films he portrays characters that are a bit rough around the edges, stilted, socially awkward, and slightly abusive towards women. Well, he's actually abusive towards men as well. He just shoots them outright. But only the bad ones, of course. And the female characters are written to be attracted to him, despite his awkwardness, despite his unkempt appearance, and despite his abusiveness. There's that God thing going on. Fear him, love him at the same time. It's incoherent, it's putrid, it's horrible. It's kind of the same rapey apologetics. Love your abuser. It's kind of yucky. But have absolute trust at the same time. It's weird. So for me, the notion is disturbing because it's about power and helplessness. The notion that the female characters are so desperate in their dire situation that they will hitch up to him, someone they would otherwise avoid. The notion is that society is ill and the Christ Saviour engages in these grandiose struggles against all these ills, corruption, abuse of power, ironically, and Breen's character assumes a judge, jury and executioner position. I don't know whether this is Breen expressing a certain cathartic effect through the use of his art. Why not? There's lots of YouTubers do the same thing. I'm doing it to an extent here, and we've seen the great copium wars. And I think also these kind of fantasies that I've been talking about, the daydream fantasies of being the ultimate saviour, are a kind of internal cathartic mechanism that, at least in our own mind, we've set the world to rights. And it's a way of coping almost with all the injustices that are going on, because sometimes you do want to just stand up and scream and wish that it'd all be washed away in a single go, and if only you had the power to do that. So LARPers, incels, I reckon all they want is actually significance, understanding, and to be found attractive, don't we all? But again, it's exemplified in those who are not able to command significance, those who are misunderstood, and those who are not found to be attractive. We might all want those things, but some of us are just born good looking with access to money that puts us in positions where people will listen to us because for whatever. So the mistake I think many make is the conflating of getting attention with being attractive. I think did we talk about attractiveness in the last one? No, I think I'll come back to it at the end of this one. So again, the contemporary example is Trump and the offensive racists who class their awful rhetoric as jokes. They misattribute their fascistic social media follower count as fans, and therefore their actions in their mind are validated solely on the metric of a social media sub-count rather than actual engagement. It's not the same thing. In broad terms, it's like, I must be right because I'm famous on the internet. I must be making good films because so many people watch them. I've also noticed that fascism was all about power and clout, and often instead of increasing one's personal power by skill development and general self-improvement, they put others down. And by putting others down, they are relatively lifted above them. So now they get their feelings of superiority and they can affirm their greatness because no one else comes up to their measure because they've just stamped on them. They've put them down and humiliated them. And so for such people to win in this endeavour, they must pick a victim that they know that they can win against. They could not tolerate a loss. So who shall they pick on? Well, the weakest, of course. And then after they've picked on the weak and beaten them by whatever means, after that, to increase their feeling of power, they shall add humiliation on top. So hence the constant barrage towards the marginalised groups. It's in the rhetoric. So surely you have seen Ken Copeland on the interwebs mocking the press for suggesting that Biden will win the presidency. Ha 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 ha, he mocked. You're going to feel so stupid when it turns out you were wrong. Imagine how bad the newspapers are going to be when they're shown to be wrong. So it's not just good enough for them that we, you, others are proved wrong, but the humiliation of that failure needs to follow up. Perhaps we can imagine the impoverished model of the world such a person has. It makes learning and improvement impossible for them, since change or improvement in their minds acknowledges an insufficiency. And in this putrid model, this is to be experienced as humiliating. They don't want to face humiliation, therefore they can't even accept that it is possible to be improved. I can only assume this is how their parents brought them up. It's all wrapped up in this trope of fear me, love me, and character building with tools of shame, guilt and humiliation. So no wonder these folk are actually crying out for attention. I think most people find this kind of personality repugnant or repulsive, or both, which makes the holder of that personality want the attention even more. And because they lack the distinction, they lack the requisite variety in behaviour, they only know one way to get attention, to be more vile. Matt Powell, looking at you. Trump, too. Look at Trump's executive orders of his last day, granting the ability of homeless shelters to turn away queer teenagers. Social service providers can discriminate based upon sexual orientation. Adoption agencies can turn away same-sex couples. And queer teens have the highest rate of homelessness of any group. So, instead of helping those in most need, they are extra punished. The suffering is the point. The humiliation is how they get their satisfaction. It's not just good enough that these queer teenagers have been kicked out of the home. We have to humiliate them on top by denying them any kind of help as well. There's something else between the lines. Take that famous clip of Ken Copeland, who used anxiety and fear of looking stupid and almost personally guaranteeing humiliation in being wrong by laughing like he did. At that sermon, he was inviting the audience to laugh at the press with him. But it was also a subtle warning that if any one of the congregation breaks ranks and is wrong, and they are wrong for doing so, and also wrong in the matter, then they will have all these people laughing at them. Your humiliation awaits should you be wrong, and if you don't agree with us here today, then you are already wrong. This denies change. It locks down any deviant ways, or what they might regard as degenerate ways. It denies the risk of making a choice outside of the collective. It denies free thought. It denies new ideas, which is the point of life. And from a putrid filter of only being able to discern good and evil, good people here in Ken Copeland's flock are good. Anyone and everyone else is therefore evil. It's a childlike thought process, black and white thinking with a non sequitur chaser. It denies everything outside of doctrine and labels that as evil. Change itself becomes evil. And change, because it's haphazard, doesn't fit in with a paradigm of godly order. Therefore, change itself is also evil for this reason. And people who want to live outside of orthodoxy are evil. They will see the gays and the homos and asexuals and all those who don't fuck missionary with the opposite sex partner for the sole purpose of procreation as degenerates. They seem to see them as a threat, and in their worldview, rightly so, because it represents change, it represents difference. And not insofar as gay people are something new, they've always been there, not so much as lesbians or asexuals or furries are new, they've always been there too. No, it's the general acceptance in society of these groups which they fear, and that is a change. And there are several factors at work here. Firstly, the bullies need marginalised groups to kick down on, which elevates their position. I mean, it doesn't, but only in relative terms. They stay where they are, but because they're kicking other people down, the difference is increased. And so the perception that they've held the high ground. They need groups to pour scorn on, to have the label of evil to which they can grade their own righteousness and purity. They need scapegoats to blame when things go bad. Earthquakes, God's punishment for the gays, I suppose. All this hate and vitriol and harm is done only in the name of their religion, because it's through these things that their religion is defined. If society becomes accepting of gays and queers and furries and all different types, then there's nothing to set apart their religion as morally elevated upon which to market it to the new generation and further recruits of future tithings. This is perhaps why religions mostly deny or refute things like evolution, because evolution normalizes constant change, and change that is to them out of control. It's not by divine intervention, it's by natural forces way outside of their control, way outside of their understanding. And if they allow that, and then they have to allow all these other things as well that are outside of their control, that they don't like, that they fear, like normalizing gay marriage, or normalizing homosexuality, or normalizing any other of the degenerate things as labelled. Yeah, so natural change. Some things die out, and if they accept natural change, then they must accept the notion that some things die out. Old things, relics, old ceremonies, old traditions must inevitably die out if they accept that change is inevitable, but they can't because they want it to be. So, in the natural world, some things die out, something else takes its place. This is their ultimate denial, to deny change, to remain conservative, to keep tradition alive, to impose the old ways, to live to doctrine, to deny new information. Those scriptures can't be updated because then, well, they wouldn't be scriptures. And I think I've mentioned it before on the channel, listening to debates where you've got a hardline religious extremist and a scientist. The extremist will open by saying, well, I read one of your science books. It was written 400 years ago, and it's clearly wrong. And the scientist says, yeah, that's why we update the textbooks. The new version was out last year. Things have improved. We've got better over the last 400 years. And the other guy couldn't get it. It's like, no, but it says in this ancient book that this is the way. Well, yeah, we update information. But it says in the 400-year-old version that it was like this. And that's more in line with God's word, because 400 years ago, we weren't so aware of things. Just couldn't get his head around the idea that it was okay to update information. And it was so telling, his scripture was fixed, the world was fixed, and there's no change. It's in chase of this endeavour of perfection, and if perfection is no change, then perfection is stagnation. And how can stagnation be perfection? It just seems an incoherent position. Yeah, but these things like evolution and the acceptance of non-normative behaviours and ideas and notions, which eventually do normalise, are also fuel for a persecution complex. All these things that they can turn and abuse merely as an instrument of their own desire to win, to remain in an assumed dominant position, to affirm their righteousness and to affirm their moral superiority so that they can continue to preach and tell people how to live. And now past the donation trade because the church roof is leaking and God has seen fit not to mend his own house roof directly. And what's just so sad to me is this kind of extreme fundamentalism can only maintain their own position through the denigration, humiliation and suffering of anyone outside of their doctrine. And it's just horrible. It seems consistent with the so-called black-pilled and incels that seem to have this obsession that women will only seek out the most attractive men. Of course, this is a projection based on the assumption that all women have the same mental distinctions as the incels do. And by attractive, of course, they're talking about aesthetics, good looks. It's all that counts. It's all that they can see. It's the only distinction they built. And they have this obsession about rating women, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. Everything's put into this really tight categories based on superficial aesthetics. And then they start wandering into absurd thinking, that the natural consequences of women only going for the hot men, in their minds, creates a kind of genetic pooling, which they then manipulate into thinking that this reduction in gene pool diversity is then grounds to enforce rules upon women as to who they can and can't fuck. Ironically, the same result, not that it's valid in the first place, could be reached by enforcing rules upon men as to who they fuck. But of course, no, they just can't see it that way. An incel who's taken the black pill has adopted the belief, this is what it's all about, adopting beliefs, that they are hopeless. And as I said, I've mentioned it before, the trivium of beliefs, generalizations about limits, causes and meanings, and entwined in that are perceptions about worth, worthlessness, hope and helplessness. And, hopelessness is a bad place to be. It means, there's that, generalization about meaning again, it means, in the context of belief, their lack of success romantically and sexually is permanent, regardless of any changes they may try to make. It's a lost cause, there's no point, and this is where it wanders into nihilism. And if anything that I do to make changes to myself is futile, then the only thing left to try is to change others or to enforce others to do things. The lexicon in the incel community is fascinating. I mean, it's defeatist and nihilistic, but on the positive side, it does show creativity, albeit in the pursuit of, as one thing, objectifying women. And I wonder if only they could apply their creativity in the opposite direction. So I mentioned both Breen and the incel and the black pill as it highlights the consequences of selecting only certain distinctions from the thousands available, which then become the axis upon which they make judgments about life. These distinctions lock in perspective and they lock in perceptive ability. So in terms of incels, if one believes they are forever alone, abbreviated to FA, then it does lead to certain conclusions about life, and that leads to certain behaviours, the self-fulfilling prophecy. And there is always a marketer who spots this in the market and can exploit it. So if you put the disenfranchised in a constant state of paranoia and delusion, whereby they accept that they have nothing to live for, but you promise salvation just around the corner that never actually comes, you can make a lot of money. Oh my gosh, so many grifters come to mind. Roosh V, Dan Bilzerian, David Avocado Wolf, Dan Baker, Pat Robertson, Ken Copeland, and any evangelical TV preacher, any woo-woo peddler, New Age shitty chakra astrologers, mystic med types. They're all in that business. They're selling never-ending hope to those who have almost lost all hope. And Breen also, by the way, borders on mysticism in some of his films. And now that I think about it, so do Nazis. They have a strong association with occultism. So again, a contemporary example, Trump, who is always just about to sign this deal, is always just about to sign that deal, is always just about to sign the medical thing, is always just about to sign the immigration thing, is always just about to have the deep state arrested and executed. Neil Breen films also focus on the summary execution of corrupt corporate executives. Incels are promised hot women, but only if they attend a week-long pick-up artist seminar, often led by lunatics who are there only to fleece young, naive, insecure people by pretending to have success with women, but instead of a record of strong relationships and empowerment and growth and learning, they may claim to say things like, I've slept with 200 women. But, truth be told, each one of those women quickly realised the guy was an asshole and moved on quickly, hence the high churn rate, hence the high body count. It's not a sign of success, it's actually a sign of failure. Which brings me back to the notion that fascism and Nazism have strong elements of anxiety with masculinity and male performance. They mistake masculinity, whatever that is, for tokens of power and domination. And I've noticed this expressed in the PUA community, and Neil Breen films, and Trump. It all leads to dictatorships and rule by authoritarianism. Instead of being attractive or working towards developing personal personality and having hobbies and activities that others want to be around and find interesting and would be drawn to, they try to impose or force the attractiveness by, say, removing all other alternatives of choice, by gaslighting, by separating people from their friends and family, so that the only person left that they can go to is the gaslighter, the abuser. It's wicked controlling behaviour and bullying and putting down and demeaning and humiliating everyone else, so that it leaves the abuser looking good. Unfortunately, the only person they convince is often themselves. Well, I say that, but holy shit, Trump had millions fooled, and this is the crux of it. Those millions seem to me grew up lacking the distinctions and ability to be attractive in of themselves and looked to their saviour, much in the same way as I'm reminded by vampire films. You know, the town's been cleaned up of the dregs by the vampire. Things are looking up. He's on our side. It's a mistake. And as a lot of QAnon supporters are finding out today, power, Q, never on your side. Power's interest may temporarily seem aligned, but they will not be for long. You know, we spoke about power previously as the ability to control people's choices. And if people have a minimal set of distinctions, they're very much easier to manipulate, as their map of the world is simplistic and easily decoded by the observer. I'm thinking also too now that racialized ideology makes a mistake of assuming that people of the same racial profile, now let's take the stereotypical blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan type, will, it's assumed, hold similar beliefs. Again, there's an assumption based purely on superficial aesthetics. And in combination with this anxiety, the master race, they seek to rid their location, their proximity, of anything that doesn't conform to that aesthetic, in the assumption that this will eradicate anything that will criticise or have a difference of opinion or is a threat to their fragility. And in this, there must be some self-acknowledgement that they see themselves as inferior. But they just can't admit this inferiority because it leads to the humiliation, and they just can't do that. So in a room full of the inferior and inept, no one will call out anyone else for a couple of reasons. First of all is this will invite criticism back. But also, being inept, they don't have the discerning capability to call out anyone else. They just don't notice the ineptness in the room. And so it becomes some mass delusion of Dunning-Kruger. Without actual competence in their midst, their delusion of superiority goes unchecked. It strikes me this mechanism will also look like unfaltering loyalty to the mastermind who enacted this. You know, you get a room full of followers that have no discernment to realise that they're being taken for a ride, and they all cheer on their leader because they don't have the capacity to realise how dumb this is. That looks like loyalty, but I suspect it isn't. It's just dumb following dumb. You know, I mean, I suppose it is from a certain point of view alluring to eradicate competence, and then being the only ones left, we inherit power, yay! So I don't know whether it's a mistake to talk of such people as Hitler, Mussolini, Himmler, Trump as being charismatic and genius leaders playing some 4-5D chess. No, it's the opposite. And we've now recently witnessed it. Another characteristic I've noticed is the way fascists and Nazi types speak. You will hear in their words constant degradation of people they don't like. Not the ideas, but the people. I promise you they can't even say the words Vice President Kamala Harris. It'll be VP, because it's not Vice President, VP. Kabbalah, not her proper name. Or it'll be VP Camel Toe, some stupid insult bullshit. And then there'll be the constant vague gesturing to imagined hypocrisy. You know, we've talked about this before. They don't have any arguments. They can only engage at a level that tries to show that their opponent that they don't like is flawed or mentally unstable because what they said last week doesn't tally exactly with what they said last week, and therefore, hypocrisy. So instead of arguing merits or facts, they try and point out this imagined hypocrisy or a contradiction that they perceive as present in the objects of their derision. This is reactionary, and of course, politicians or indeed anyone can change their mind as the times and context change, new circumstances, new data comes to light, along with which comes a new evaluation and therefore new policies. But oh my God, the politician that updates policy as a measured response is called out for hypocrisy. This lack of awareness to the greater context, lack of sensitivity, lack of distinctions. Nevertheless, even in the case where someone says something that isn't a word-perfect repetition of a policy of last year's, this discrepancy is leapt on as an example of hypocrisy or flip-flopping, and then, as per Machiavelli, used as an example of weak leadership. See, they're flip-flopping, and they might have just misspoke a word or just used a different verb or something. I suppose the hope is that as each leader is pointed out as weak, they're ridiculed out of existence, and at the end of time, the only one left standing is the fascist. You know, it's the same old game. Instead of actually taking personal responsibility for growth, these types work endlessly to destroy and undermine others, so that it is they who remain, kind of like a war of attrition. It's a flawed outlook. As per Breen's films as well, the idea that a single hacker, which he always seems to take on this character in his film, can infiltrate cyber systems of government that have been built over decades by thousands of the brightest minds money can buy, it's just absurd. Because at least one of those thousands has got to be at least as good as Breen. If not, 2 or 3 of them are going to be as brilliant. If not, then, well, the thousands who have built these superstructures. It's just a delusion. And this type of delusion is so far ingrained that it holds so much contempt for the people that they dislike. So much so that not even the slightest amount of respect can be forwarded. Like I say, they will never address the people they dislike with their official titles. Just think again of contemporary example of Trump and the nicknames he gave to those he didn't like. It's a way of making reference to people for which they have such disdain without actually acknowledging them as even a person, or even a person in office, or even an equal. Pinker covered a little bit about this when he described the use of words to describe effluvia. Shit, cum, blood, piss, yuck. And should you shout these words in a social gathering, you will cut into the attention of the people who are there. People are on alert for the nasty and distasteful stuff. After all, it may be toxic and harmful, and we would wish to avoid it. So the use of these words cuts into our consciousness. So here Trump gets a double win by being obnoxious. He cuts into our consciousness, and by attaching that obnoxiousness to a person, it denigrates them at the same time. So by giving people pejorative nicknames, he avoids even having to acknowledge them as equals or having to think of them as contemporaries, and at the same time denigrates them to his followers who adopt the same language. Sleepy Joe. Well, turns out Sleepy Joe is now president, but Shifty Swift, Low Energy Jeb, Crooked Hillary, and particularly filthy was the Low IQ Waters, no doubt referencing the IQ race question. And he referred to that guy on CBS as a reference to Stephen Colbert, who has slammed him relentlessly in most humorous mockery. And in return, Colbert started to refer to Trump as the president, never by his name, and in his videos he always used T*** instead of Trump's name. At the same time, Trump had nicknames for people he liked. British Trump, our Boris. Trump of the Tropics, fascistic leader Bolsonaro. Juan Trump, president of Mexico. See, he's stamped them with his brand. You're one of me, and everyone else. They're crooked, low energy, shifty, sleepy, whatever. It doesn't even acknowledge them as I say. The use of these pejorative terms also stirs up contempt in the audience listening. Like I said in the video ages back, I don't even know who Joe is, but I know he's sleepy. When it comes out on the ballot paper, for example, I don't want to vote for someone who's sleepy, or, over the hill, or crooked. It's just, Trump is using a stochastic attack that dehumanizes all his opponents. It's the way to do it. It's the way to get power. It's Machiavellian. It's right out of the book, for sure. Should it be allowed? They say all's fair in love and war. That being said, then, I'll go back to what I said earlier, that if we are to have this kind of free speech absolutism, we need to educate the young ones with a set of distinctions to enable them to make more useful evaluations, rather than just, someone said they were sleepy. Well, let me state one explicitly for those thinking of going into comedy because their friends laugh at their xenophobic, discriminatory or racist, bigoted screechings and mistake it for comedy. To those listening or watching that don't know the appropriate distinction, one of them is often expressed as, would you like it if someone did that to you? Or would you like it if someone said that about you? I've since discovered, though, for some, they lack the ability to make this simple distinction and simply just can't put themselves in other people's shoes. I've been amazed to realise that some people can't actually do it. They will nod their head as if to say, yeah, I know what that means, but they don't. So let me offer an easier rule of thumb. Do not make fun, or take the piss, or humiliate people, or select for singling out things about the person for which they had no control over. This includes, but not limited to, their sex, their gender, their skin colour, their race, their body type, where they were born, any medical issues they have, and especially don't mock them for bad things that happened to them that were not their fault. Like bad accidents caused by someone else. Like sexual abuse they experienced. Fuzzy areas, Some do not have control over that. For some, it's a medical issue. Hairstyles and clothing choice are fair game, as that was a choice, as is the piece of shit car they bought, or other stupid decisions they made. You can joke about sexual abuse and rape and race if you have to, but in a general sense. That is, to poke fun at the concepts or the lexems, but not people's direct experience of it. I mean, it can be done, but the comedian that does so isn't a comedian. They're just leveraging the suffering of others to their own advantage. It's pretty shitty, and it's not funny. And people who laugh at that just take pleasure in the humiliation, subjectification, and pain of others. It's not just that joking about specific instances of sexual abuse is offensive, but after a while it normalises the behaviour, the conversations, the terms enter the zeitgeist. It's not taboo anymore, and then it starts to edge its way into the window of acceptability, and then harm actually occurs. No, we need to keep these distinctions. The only exception to make fun of someone who experienced something horrific when it was not self-chosen is when it had occurred to the comedian who pokes fun at themselves. And that isn't an invitation for anyone to dogpile in afterwards, by the way. That's their prerogative. Seems a lot of people just don't know what they believe in, or what to believe in, and repeat the average of their local noise, which feeds back into the local noise so that their friends hear the echo and repeat back with added edge. Where this local group is insensitive, it just gets worse. It's a race to the bottom, much like the alt-right and far-right now, which is a kind of battle royale where only the most extreme rhetoric survives. Boy, today the videos are coming out of the copium, spelt with a Q, the Cupium. You know, people in tears. Where's Trump? Where's Trump? Where's Q? What's going on? Why haven't they imposed martial law? Trump, come and save us. And even the Q account on Reddit has disavowed their own posts, making claim it was only satire and a joke. It's just a joke, bro. But people have lost their lives. That woman who believed in Q, 14-year veteran, first through the door into the inner chamber, got shot in the neck, dead. These people, they've not built sufficient distinctions, nor the fortitude to go against the grain, nor the convictions to make a stand against the group who are doing damage in an additive way for which it's easy for any single individual to diffuse their responsibility. It's the madness of crowds, it's the feeding frenzy. People get into these modes and they just don't stop and think. Things move too fast for them to stop and think. They just go with the flow and become convinced of things like Q. Also, these days people are lonely and they want to fit in. Myself, I went the other way. I kicked friends out of my life who turned out to be harbouring ultra-far-right bigoted racisms. Some knew, some didn't, some couldn't be reached, their delusions too far gone, and now looking back, I realised they lacked the ability to make the distinctions. I wondered why my conversations with them weren't getting anywhere. They were nodding their head, but in retrospect, they just didn't have the kind of sophistication to understand the nuance in the arguments. And now that I think about it, I kind of wonder about mathematics as well. You know, mathematics just seems full of distinctions of abstractions, high-level thinking. I wonder if there's a correlation there between how good people are at maths and their ability to discern conspiracy theory. Yeah, anyway, just as a note on US politics, by the way, right now at this moment, there is talk of Trump starting his own party, the Patriot Party or whatever. And I guess McConnell is now compelled, as per the Machiavellian directive, to pursue prosecutions against Trump. Crush your future enemies before they get power. So if Trump gets a foothold here and he starts a significant party, it's only going to take resources and voters and support away from the current Republican Party. And if Trump does get traction on this, he'll put the Republican Party at risk of being split. So if McConnell's got any political gusto about him, he'll crush Trump, or aid in it anyway. Yeah, unfortunately though, from a consequentialist point of view, there isn't much difference between racism that's instigated from ignorance and racism instigated from deliberate hate and bigotry. This is where stochastic terrorism comes in, just like we saw in the US Capitol in Washington in early Jan 2021. So think about the senators and talking heads and media folk that implicitly supported this attempted coup. See how quickly they backtracked and are now saying how terrible it was. They denounce it, they disavow and condemn violence, but they still support the underlying reasons that led to those people to attack the Capitol. They stirred it with rhetoric that was manipulative. They said things like, the election was being stolen from you. Your rights are being taken away. You are going to be living in a Chinese slave state unless you take action. You need to march to the capital. And we get what we got. And now, what do these inciters say now? We denounce the tragic and unexpected actions. We reject violence in all forms. And then they blame Antifa. So they incite insurrection, then bold-faced lie, and then they leave the insurrectionists out to hang, and then distance themselves, and then talk about the need for healing. They're just saying the words. Can't possibly mean it. They haven't even had time to emotionally process this. There's no empathy. There's no understanding. There's no semantic value in this. It's just a response of syntax. And democracy can't function like this. There has to be clear distinctions and insistence that those in positions of power, especially elected positions, work in good faith. To incite a coup and then denounce it a day later is far from good faith. The bad faith actors have to be removed. Those who did the mild bit of insurrection perhaps need a spell and a quiet place to reflect and develop the necessary distinctions before they can be reintegrated to society. I have a certain amount of sympathy for them, but they've effectively been brainwashed, hoodwinked, lied to, much like the Brexiters here in the UK. They've fallen for the same kind of rhetoric, and it's done our country a great deal of damage. Distinctions, language, phrasing, tall tales of truth and propaganda, and knowing the difference, having nuance to spot it, having intent to do so, and deciding with intent rather than reaction. And there again is a massive difference in distinction. Progressives and reactionaries. So take for example the Sikhs and the Muslims after 9/11. Not many cared for the distinction between the two. Very different religious outlooks between those two groups, but they were bundled into the one. So again, it seems to be the case that under stress and hot wash reactionary conditions, the mind seems much less capable of making distinctions, and everything gets lumped together as a threat, and then the bubble of anxiety forms, and then inappropriate distinctions are made, with us or against us. Like me, not like me. White and Christian, not white, not Christian. And then it gets generalized to an exaggerated form. We see photographs of the people who did these atrocities, and they are not white, and they were not Christian. And then anything not white and not Christian gets labelled as bad, with no nuance or distinction. The rhetoric that instigated that coup attempt was very much of the form democracy or Chinese takeover, rights or no rights, slavery or freedom. Not exactly subtle distinctions, and it seems no one took Obi-Wan's warning, only a Sith Lord thinks in absolutes. Naturally, I spot the absolute of that claim also. Nevertheless, the contrast between freedom and the bogeymen of the CRP was agitated to the extreme. I note the American bogeyman has shifted from Russia to China. There are numerous distinctions, and at many levels, and we'll get back to this when we get back to science and entropy and so on, but the obvious example is the experience of everyday natural occurrences. Things move, and we see them, and we seem to have an intuition about it, and I might imagine in the very early stages of language development, it was used to express immediate descriptions of the world, even if this was just a shrill at the sight of a lion. So Newtonian models of reality, where, for example, orbital mechanics, Newtonian physics is good enough, but then for the really small stuff, we need a different model, and down to the quantum mechanics we go. It's a different map. That map shows different scales where it's useful to make things like microprocessors and mobile phones and the extensive communication networks. Applying quantum physics to things the size of planets is inappropriate and overly complex, and taking Newtonian to physics down to subatomic particle levels doesn't work. Gravity doesn't apply at those small scales. Well, maybe it does, but we can't seem to tell. So the point is, these maps, they create new possibilities, and this is the thing about science and repeatable models. They not only explain the observations, but also enable reliable predictions about the what if, when, where and how much. The why is the ongoing investigation. So I'm losing track a little bit about what we've covered on the channel. I'm sure I've mentioned Bose-Einstein condensates before, and if not, I'm sure I'll mention it again when we get back on track with the science section. But this is where molecules and atoms decohere absolutely. And they effectively smudge out. So where one atom is and where another one is, it's not really distinguishable anymore. And so we get this Bose-Einstein condensate that is the substance that has no discernible difference within the constituents that make it up. In fact, when you look at it, you can't even tell that it's made up of anything. There's nothing in it that's distinguishable. All distinctions are kind of faded out. So within that mass, there are no differences between particles, and there are no differences in momentum of those particles. There's no difference in angular spins of those particles. There's just no differences at all. No up, no down, no discernible distance between anything, because there are no distinguishable particles at all. It's just, Bose-Einstein condensate. It is what it is. It's just something maybe that has no distinguishable parts. And it has strange and funky effects that we're just starting to learn about. Time of events also gets warped. Experiments have fired lasers into Bose-Einstein condensates, and the timing of that light has showed that the light has been slowed to just 17 or 18 miles an hour. It has very interesting properties, and possibly for more uses in volatile storage devices. There's some scant literature that suggests that BCEs can be used to produce effects of negative mass. Not antimatter, but more specifically negative gravitational mass. And I'll leave that one there, beyond my pay grade. Won't be long before a flat earther picks it up and misconstrues it into an anti-gravity device, while at the same time maintaining there is no such thing as gravity, because flat earthers. So the point about the BCEs, no discernible attributes, and thus the substance, it kind of wanders into this realm of unidentifiable stuff. What is it? I kind of introduced this concept in the decisions episode way back when. So a point is that with no dimension, and a line is a point drawn out in one dimension, and a plane is a line drawn out in the perpendicular dimension to the line, and a cuboid is an extrusion of a plane, and so on. It's distinction upon distinction, and each brings new possibilities. And these are all relational. So the cube relational to its planes, the planes relational to the lines, and the lines relational to the points, and the points relational to... so this is it. To make sense, we mark such distinctions. It starts with a point, then a line, and the plane in solid form. And when we start with the point, we have a reference that distinguishes the point, from everywhere else. And now with this description, we can be there, or we can be somewhere else. Before this distinction, we could not say, we could not describe. And I'm labouring the point, no pun, to make a tenuous link between language and neurology. I'm a bit of a hack at this, but it seems to me somehow our brains know both our position and orientation in space. Many other living organisms seem to be able to make distinctions in light, dark, pressure, vibration. We have the cochlea of the ear for balance, and we have a notion of our extent of reach within our local space. We know roughly how far we can jump and how far we cannot. We know when a gap's too big to jump, even though we've never jumped that specific gap before. We have a good sense of it. So, again, to emphasize the idea, it's our interaction with the world that builds up these distinctions. Metaphorical travel. We take it for granted, and I wonder about people who are not able to make these distinctions for whatever reason. Brain chemistry, I don't know if it's fair to include autism in there, or even psychopathy or brain atrophy. I'm even wondering if particular cultural practices actually are strange attractors for psychopathy or this type of brain atrophy. Say the films, the books, and the insistence on faith over reason within that culture means that the brain of young children simply hasn't matured. It doesn't develop these distinctions, and then when the brain loses its plasticity without these distinctions, as adults, it's very hard to put them in. Much like the feral children we talked about in the last episode. It's very hard for them to learn language after a certain age of not learning language, and even when they do, they seem to have a really difficult time abstracting. So they seem closed off to certain questions and fail to make extra distinctions. Perhaps some people are just unable, some have not learned, and some have chosen deliberately not to do so. So consider the point then, here or elsewhere, and now let's extend the point to a line. And now we can be above the line or below the line. It's a more refined distinction. And then we can extend that line into a plane, and you're either on it or outside of it. Plus, you can also be close to the centre or dwindling on the edges. Extend to 3D, and of course we're in the box or out of the box thinking. And this is where AI comes in a little bit. In this example, we've gone from no dimensions, the point, to 3 dimensions in a cube. The models built to enable AI are hundreds of dimensions. And this is how they do it in AI. The level, the number of abstractions are very high. And so human beings have a natural ability to distinguish cat faces from dog faces and from human faces, and especially faces between individuals. Apparently this is a specialized function of the brain. I don't know too much about that, not looked into it. Nevertheless, the discernment capability for most people is there. And I think there are conditions that some people have to live with where the brain doesn't have this ability, or it's been lost and they can't tell. They don't recognize people. I'd like also to make a clarification here, or actually another distinction, quite a critical one. I alluded to it in the graphics of a few moments ago. It's one thing to be able to detect difference and to make distinctions between those differences, but it's also another distinction to recognize that the label or the grouping isn't the thing itself. Again, I've realized that this is quite misunderstood in general. An example of this is the so-called genetic fallacy, an informal logical fallacy, where we attribute or have expectations about a thing just because of where that thing came from. That is to say that it may be approximately true or an average to say that typically things that come from this region are this way, and then for convenience any one individual or item that comes from that place is also tarred with the same brush where it may not necessarily be true. There's always exceptions. However, heuristics, human nature, we do take shortcuts and we like to do this kind of grouping. And then, as I said, it matters then how our attitudes towards this group are manipulated. And I did a video on this years ago about, I tried to get the notion across by putting certain people on a tile, and that tile is their label, and then we move the tile. We don't move the person, but the person's on the tile. So if we move the tile from a region of what we like and what we think of as good, and then we move that tile into a region of what we think is bad, because the person still stood on the tile they come with. But we haven't moved the person, they've stood still in their reference frame. They are unchanged. It's just that now we've moved them in our mind by sliding the labels, or the valence or salience of the labels we use to describe them. Then we can now paint that person or individual. So, a crass example, there are people, there are men, there are women. And then if we demonize women, the actual label or the group women, then we can easily say that any individual within that group, a woman, is also evil, demon, witch, whatever. And that's how it's done. Even in the so-called intellectual sports like chess, it's remarkable that even now some grandmasters maintain the view that women just aren't capable. They say their brains are wired differently, and while they admit that women can play to some standard, they will never be grandmasters until one woman beat the grandmaster. Dear. But this comes back to priming, and one of the examples I was stunned to find out is how GPA grades were lifted for black people in school during Obama's presidency. I also heard that Whoopi Goldberg made comment about Nichelle Nichols and her position with regard to acting in the Star Trek series. Suddenly here is a person of colour right next to, well, still a white captain, but right up there. And Whoopi made comment, this signalled that we were allowed, that it was possible. Much in the same way that Bones, McCoy, inspired many people to be doctors, much in the same way that Spock, Leonard Nimoy, inspired many people to go into science. And so, this is an interesting thing. It's all relative. And it's fluid, and so we have to be a bit careful. And the example I keep highlighting is the Next Generation, where Geordie LaForge, one of the few people of colour in that series, is down in the bowels of the good ship Enterprise in the engine room. It's not too far a stretch to say rowing, whilst the white captain is, plotting the courses of the good ship Enterprise. Now, so from one point of view, it looks like we're still keeping those stereotypes. From another point of view, you can say, well, Geordie LaForge's character is painted as an engineer, a man of accomplishment, a very important role. The ship don't go nowhere without him. This isn't about Star Trek, but I think actually Geordie LaForge's character was one of the most interesting in that series. He got up to lots of different things. And specifically in regard to chess, experiments have been done. The psychologists are always at it. They're always looking for new lab rats, and they found it with chess players. And so they wanted to find out, can women play chess as well as men? So they devised these games, all online, so that you couldn't confirm the gender or sex of the opponent. And the psychologists, psychiatrists, as they always do, prime, mislead and lie to people. And in these series of games, they had women play opponents. Sometimes they were told that the opponent was female, and sometimes they were told that their opponent was male. In the experiments, they were always playing male opponents. However, their results differed when they thought they were playing a woman as compared to when they thought they were playing a man. And sometimes the women actually played against the same player several times, but were told on different occasions, yes, this is a woman you're playing, yes, this is a man you're playing. And what they found out is that the performance of the women was reduced by 50% when they were reminded of the stereotype and the fact that they were playing against a male opponent. The report notices that the difference in performance is particularly impressive if one considers that the opponent was exactly the same. So this is what I'm saying. It's one thing to have the distinguishment, the ability and discernment to realise that there are differences. It's another to put them into convenient groups, which by and large, well, this is the big question artificial intelligence is trying to answer. Where exactly are those boundaries so that we can know whether it's a cat or a dog or a bear or a dog bear or a bear dog? Sometimes nature itself is a bit fuzzy. And then how we treat that group as a whole. So we need to be careful, need to be cautious. So just to give a really obvious example, here on the screen are some circles, different coloured circles that I'm going to say represent a particular type of food. But they're going to be known as sweet, like biscuits and apple pie. And just to illustrate variance, I'm going to colour them slightly different shades, but principally of the same colour. Just different shades to show how some are more sweet than others. And that's what the intensity and shade are going to represent. And then down here, I'm going to create a different cluster of what's going to be representative of spicy foods. There's going to be a range of spicy foods, things like chilies and curries, and the degree of spicy is going to be represented by the shade of red. And now we have two clusters, and let's call them blue cluster and red cluster. And by doing so, we've kind of removed any emotional attachment we have during our analysis for the purposes such that we don't introduce unconscious bias by referring to spicy or sweet foods that we may or may not have a preference for. And here's a really subtle thing. So look at these two groups. You can see that there are colour differences within the groups. But let's take these two red circles and these two blue circles, and then I'm going to ask which is more red in terms of its own group, the red group, and which is more blue compared with the other blue. Can you qualitatively describe the difference in colour hues between the reds and between the blues, and whether the difference in red shades is greater than the difference in blue shades? And if you can, on what basis? Have you been able to analyse the light wavelength and then deduce the difference on the distance and the relative frequency of that light? It's a bit of a big ask, but a machine can do it. And then, is this comparison valid at all? So if we say that the difference between these two reds is 5 units of red, and then the same distance, the same question is asked of the blue circles, and we find that in fact, for whatever reason, whatever metric, it's 5 units of blue also. Are those units the same size? What is the distance of blue, in relative terms to distance of red? So here we are with all these kinds of problems. And so to solve these kinds of questions, the AI guys and gals are using something called latent features. So in this example of different shades of blue, we can describe them as, turquoise, cauliflower blue, cerulean blue, and the different kinds of red. If we decided we could ascribe labels such as maroon, pink, magenta, blood red. And then to analyse this, what we can say is, let's look at the full RGB component of each circle, and then we can look for a single channel and ask, is it latent across all circles? So as we know, there must be a component of RGB in every colour, even if that component is 0. For bright white light, it's, in the computer system, it's 255, 255, 255, and black is 000. And so all we have to do is take a look, analyse it against an RGB scale, and see what's there. What we know is that in pure red, there is no blue, and in pure blue, there is no red. In between, of course, there are mixes of each. So as such, we can reduce down the number of dimensions we need to track, but there is a trade-off. I'm sure we get a more robust model, but lower interpretability. That is to say, we may find representation in the data of foods that has a particular levels of red and blue, let's say, that don't reverse map into any specific label of colour. It's kind of in between maroon and magenta somewhere, something like that. Nevertheless, the latent values will tell us that something may have less blue than red, and therefore it would still be classified as spicy, but which flavour of spicy we don't quite know. So the point is, for our purposes, it's kind of a reductive approach, and with the AI and machine learning, the algorithms go looking for these critical latent values. They see past our own categories. Specifically, what is the frequency of light that is maroon? And pink isn't even a colour, and don't get me started on beige. Yet by analysing the components, the constituents, machine learning does away with our human valued labels and crunches down to latent features. How much red, how much blue. And in this exercise, actually, green makes no difference, as it's not a factor in distinguishing between these sets of colours. And so the search space is now even reduced. To explicate further, society has attached valence, salience and desirability or revulsion to labels and categories, which carries a payload of meaning which affects our behaviour. As with a tiles illustration describing things and people and groups with terms that have semantic payloads, we can be manipulative either by intent or by accident, and we can even change public perception about particular labels. But we do this all the time. We create a relativistic idea of normative acceptability. Of course, reactionaries want to go back to the olden ones, and progressives want to explore new meanings and behaviours. So where we start with a null, an indiscernible void, and suddenly make a point, we have a distinction, the point and everywhere else, but also an emergent third perspective that is now available to a would-be third-party observer who can see the point, the void, and the point in the void. So this is a metaphor also for perspective or perceptual positions, our point of view, all the others' point of views, and then how the whole system interacts with all these points of views as seen by the third-party impartial observer. It's the hot wash, cold wash thing. It's in the heat of the moment. It's hard to jump to the impartial observer position, let alone the counterparty's point of view. So way back when, in one of the earlier episodes, we looked at the different narratives or story types as explicated by John Truby. We had linear story types, cyclic story types, spirals, branching, explosive, meandering, and I think there was one more. I can't remember what it was. But again, these seem different ways to represent narrative, different way of telling it, different way of perceiving things. Some will be more comfortable with others, some really like the explosive narrative, some like the simple, straightforward, linear approach, some like the non-linear time-telling. It appeals to different people at different stages of development. So, it's speculation on my part, but I might imagine it's useful for humans to be able to identify friendly faces and then to be able to link that distinction to a set of characteristics and responses to that face. We see the face, we remember, this is so-and-so, and this is roughly what they believe and their values and the conversations we've had, and I'll bring all that to mind by being prompted by seeing their face in front of mine. So I wonder what it'd be like when we can kind of change face at will. TV programs have explored this, like The Expanse and especially Altered Carbon. It was present in Avengers Age of Ultron, where the robot Ultron wasn't actually anything physical. It was never present AI, in some kind of computing cloud. The physical manifestation of the robot was just its useful tool, which Ultron destroyed when Ultron created a better body for Ultron. In essence, Ultron was a distributed in the cloud set of stuff, data, algorithms, but constructed a body as a mere vessel of representation. Altered Carbon, the TV series, how do we know to treat people we meet the way we treat them? Perhaps it's been a long time since we saw our friend, or only a few moments ago, and we kind of pick up where we left off with those conversations, even if they were just minutes ago or years ago. And we always seem to be able to recall our gestalt of experience with them. We know who we are talking to. We know who we are talking to by their face or their tone and character and cadence and voice over the phone. We recognise the pattern. We know whose voice that is. And if not, their name tag at that conventional self-help seminar is stuck firmly to their chest, so we can refer to our gestalt of experiences according to the label that we happen to see. The set of distinctions enables us to identify. Thus the ability of the brain and neurology to do this was, I presume, an evolutionary advantage. Identify kin, friend or foe, that sort of thing. And I think if I've got this right, this gives rise to the notion of the embodied mind. Embodiment encompasses both the body as a lived experiential structure and the body as the context or milieu of cognitive mechanisms. Alright, we're going to have to make another abstract distinction here. Rather than say a line on a screen or a line on a piece of paper demarking above from below or left from right, we're going to now need to make the leap to abstract differentiators. I assume we imagine our lived experiences having inner qualities and outer qualities across several categories, biological and phenomenological. By the demarcation, we can't categorize one without the other, yet we do have bidirectional crossings of this demarcation. We have the inner life and the external experience, and a kind of moving average synthesis between the two, I presume, where we think stuff and do stuff, and somewhere between we experience meaning, but of course it's always in flux, at least in this simple model. But also our conclusions and meanings that we draw from this is very much dependent on our perceptual position. And perceptual positions, just to hammer home the point, are something that really good films use brilliantly. I've mentioned it before. One of my favourite films is Sicario. It's pretty grim, pretty rough watching. You have to have a decent frame of mind to be able to watch it. But there's the famous scene, and it's the one on the border crossing where things go sideways, and that's the 10 or 12 seconds of violence that the film's been leading up to. But it's a magnificent combination. Here have overhead shots as though you're looking down on the border crossing, as though you're viewing it from a helicopter from 500 feet. So you get an overall view, very distant, very impartial. It's just cars going through a gate on a road. It's, you're not involved. And then we switch to one of the agents in the car and we see events unfold from her point of view. And then we switch to one of the cartel members in their car, and then we start seeing things through their point of view. And through these clever switches in points of view, we realise, actually, these points of view are quite scarily similar, which is the point of the film. It's kind of drawing moral ambiguity. And really, I think it's saying the same thing, that whether this is right or wrong depends on your point of view. Yeah, it's a very clever film, very excellent use of framing and perceptual positions and how mirrors are used and the kind of signifiers of, reflections in glass and different perspectives, and the music as well is amazing. I'm not going to do a film analysis here, it's a bit beyond me anyway, but so if you ever do watch the film or watch it again, just keep in mind when the camera angle changes, what point of view, whose eyes are we looking through? Yeah, perceptual positions.